Welcome to this installment of Princeton Theological Seminary's Future of American Democracy series. My name is Heath Carter, and I'm the Associate Professor of American Christianity here at the seminary. It's my great pleasure to serve as the moderator of this series. Over the course of the year, we are bringing together leaders from across government, media, the church, and academy to discuss the big questions shaping our civic life together. Today's conversation, part of our spring emphasis on institutions, will focus on the serious challenges facing Christian institutions in particular, and what role they might yet play in shaping the future of American democracy. I'm delighted to be in this conversation with two well-known pastors who also happen to be leaders of major Christian organizations. Russell Moore is editor-in-chief of Christianity Today and the author of several books, including The Courage to Stand, Facing Your Fear Without Losing Your Soul, Onward, Engaging the Culture Without Losing the Gospel, and The Storm-Tossed Family, How the Cross Reshapes the Home. Reverend Adam Russell Taylor is president of Sojourners and author of A More Perfect Union, a new vision for building the beloved community. If you have questions about or suggestions for the series, please email democracy.panels@ptsim.edu. And to keep up to date with the wider conversations we're convening, check us out at ptsim.edu. Without further ado, welcome Russell, welcome Adam. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
It wasn't that long ago. You think about the lifetime of people who are still alive today, the kind of post-war era, this era of, in history circles, we call it the Postwar Revival, a period of, remarkable growth of Christian institutions. It was, you could see it in full sanctuaries, you could see it in new sanctuaries, an era of church building, literally, new buildings cropping up across the American landscape. An era when I think, in American public life, church leaders, especially Protestant leaders, but, increasingly Catholic leaders as well, could presume a kind of authority and role in the public conversation about every significant major issue. That's not all that long ago. We find ourselves today here in the 21st century in a very different moment, in a moment where I think Christian institutions of all different kinds, theologically all over the map, are facing a moment, I don't know, and I'd love to hear whether you think we should call it crisis or recalibration, a moment where, today, and if you listen to the folks at Pew Research Center, they're saying, in the lifetime of many of us alive today, we could be headed toward a moment where Christians will be in a minority in the United States, where the nones, folks who claim no religious affiliation of any kind, this is a group that kind of came onto the scene, a decade or so ago, and we've learned, maybe close to a majority of Americans that might identify as none, or at least just not affiliate religiously within, by 2070. So, it's a really interesting moment, maybe a concerning moment. I don't know. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about it, but I'd love to hear each of you think, and maybe Adam, we can start with you. How do we get to this point? Why do you think so many Americans, especially, and this is really key, I think, the sort of disaffiliation is especially widespread in younger generations. How do we get from that kind of post-war revival to this moment where lots of folks are not sure whether they even want to be affiliated with a Christian institution of any kind?
Yeah, no, thanks. It's great to be with you, and great to be with you, Russell. I mean, there's not a single reason. That being said, I would point, at least in part, to in the kind of late 90s, going into 2000s, I think a lot of young people and older people as well became increasingly disaffected and disillusioned with Christianity and with the church. And I think it's in part because they saw, at least in one branch of Christianity, a real kind of takeover by a movement, often referred to as a religious right, that in some ways weaponized the faith in ways that I think both hurt a lot of people, but also disillusioned a lot of people. There was a bunch of polling that an organization called Barna did in the 2000s that interviewed young people in particular, and they found that the three leading words that, or the kind of characteristics that young people associated with Christianity or with Christians, were that they were judgmental, hypocritical, and homophobic. Needless to say, those three characteristics don't play well, or don't necessarily, they're not good for evangelism in my perspective. And so I think that, there was this kind of trend where we saw a lot of young people not necessarily leave Jesus, but leave the church, because they saw a church that increasingly become fairly exclusive, fairly judgmental, fairly just not relevant to many of the things that they cared about. Now, kind of tied to that, I would argue that one of the ways in which we can help to rehabilitate the reputation and the kind of witness of the church is for Christians to, really kind of go back to the basics, go back to the great commandment, to love God with all of our heart, our mind, and our soul, and to love others as we love ourselves, to go back to a core commitment to unconditional love, and to try to be much more inclusive. One of the ways in which Sojourners certainly tries to reach young people, but all Christians, is to really put a commitment to justice, to restoring right relationship at the very center of faith. That it's not somehow some kind of optional thing, but it's integral to how we do our Christian discipleship. And so I'll just end with a quote that certainly has informed and inspired the way that I think we as Christians should be engaged in our public life and even in our politics. It was by Dr. King, who said that the church at its best is called not to be the master or the servant of the state, but to be the conscience of the state. And I think people are really hungry for the church to be more of that conscience. And yet, sadly, we've seen lots of examples of where some parts of the church have really played this role of trying to be the master, kind of take over one political party. And in the process, I think kind of got co-opted by that political party, and more recent by a particular political leader, i.e. former President Trump. And I think that did some real damage to the witness of the church. But I do think there's plenty of room to do repair and help redeem that reputation.
I'd love to hear, Russell. I mean, you reflect a little bit on, Adam's emphasizing the religious right. I mean, one of the big changes, obviously, too, has been the decline of mainline denominations, and the sort of evangelical worlds that I grew up in. There was a lot of talk about, sort of attributing that, the mainline went left and people left them as a result. These days we know Southern Baptists also, struggling to maintain their membership. How do you think about these questions?
Well, I think it's actually the same phenomenon. We're in a time of secularization in ways we have not seen. I mean, we have seen loss of religious faith before, but we've never been in this sort of a quickly changing, globally connected, social media sort of environment. And that has been happening for quite a while. I think that the hemorrhaging of the mainline churches and the crisis of the evangelical churches right now really are related to mirror images of the same problem, which is whether or not people perceive religion as being a means to an end. So if someone looks to the mainline church in his or her community in 1975 or 1985 and says, really, what this really is about is ethics and good politics, if they perceive it as that, or what have you. It's not necessarily that they say, I disagree with all of those things, therefore I'm walking away, although sometimes they do. It's because they're able to get those things other ways. They don't need the church in order to get there. And that was one of the reasons why there was for so long such a contrast between evangelicalism in this country and the main line. We're at a point now where that is very much under dispute, where what I'm hearing often for some of the very reasons that Adam just mentioned, younger people saying, I don't think that the church believes what it says it believes. And so it's a means to an end. Sometimes they see it as a an awful end. I mean,
Mm.
you think about the sexual abuse crises and those
Mhm.
sorts of things. In other cases, they just see it as a useful and utilitarian end,
Mm.
which seems at best manipulative and at worst, at worst manipulative and at best just irrelevant.
Mm.
Uh, so now, obviously, I don't think that's what Christianity is, and I don't think that's
Mhm.
what evangelical Christianity is. But that's the reality we're facing right now.
Let me follow up there, Russell, with the in the sort of Southern Baptist case in particular. So you recently left the SBC over its egregious mishandling of this sexual abuse crisis, and over kind of a sense that of enduring resistance or rising resistance maybe to racial justice concerns that you had really personally been quite invested in through the ERLC. I wonder, there's been a narrative, certainly in the kind of conservative wings of the SBC, going back into the late 70s and 80s, of saving the denomination from a kind of liberalizing trend that, the moderates had kind of controlled the convention through much of the mid 20s. The world that Jimmy Carter emerged out of was a bit of a different world, right, than the one that would emerge in the 80s. And I wonder, I mean, there was a kind of a little bit of a triumphalist narrative, right, that the conservatives managed to retake this denomination, saving it from becoming like, the Northern Baptists or other mainline denominations, that would have been the trajectory. Given your own recent experiences, and given also that, I mean, one of the things that happens, right, is that the denomination conservatives do take hold of the institutions of the denomination. And at that very same moment, the SBC is part of this kind of surging religious right movement, right, that really emerges on the national scene in the 80s. Do you disentangle those things? I mean, the kind of theological movement that was going on with the political, and as well as kind of the abuse crisis and all that kind of stuff. Do you see it as possible to disentangle those things, or do you see, are those things in complicated ways more entangled than maybe some folks in that conservative resurgence wanted to admit?
Well, I was talking not long ago to a friend
Mm.
who was part of the moderate
Mhm.
strand of
Mhm. Mhm.
Baptist life. I come out of the more conservative strand of Baptist life,
Yeah.
and he is looking around at the way
Mm.
that he's alienated from
Mm.
how far left
Mhm.
some of his compatriots went,
Mm.
and I quoted a friend of mine who had said, what we learned in the SBC controversy was that to some degree, both
Mm.
sides were right about each other.
Mm.
Uh, and that
Mm.
is, you had conservatives, including some
Mhm.
really good people
Mhm.
on the ground, who were
Mhm.
saying there are serious theological problems
Mm.
in Southern Baptist life, and they can't just be deflected by saying it's none of your business
Mm.
to
Mhm.
churches. I mean,
Yeah.
these issues matter.
Yeah.
And it was also true that the
Mm.
moderates were right when
Mm.
they said some of the leaders who are using
Mm.
this sense of crisis, and I
Mhm.
think in some ways a very rightly perceived crisis,
Mm.
are using that for power and
Mm.
are using that in carnal ways that ultimately will narrow
Mm.
and narrow and narrow and narrow. So
Mm.
I think one of the problems with both of the sides
Mm. Mhm.
in the
Mhm.
SBC controversy, which is replicated in some ways in all kinds of places,
Mhm. Mhm.
is that we've come to see that neither side, this wasn't a binary. These
Mhm.
were two coalitions,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
often
Mhm.
coalitions that later learned maybe we were motivated by different things.
Yeah.
And also I think there's a sense of a slippery slope
Mm.
mentality that
Mhm.
says whatever I recognize as terrible, even if I rightly recognize it as terrible,
Mm.
the answer must be
Yeah.
to run in the complete opposite direction from
Mm.
it. And
Mm.
so
Mhm.
you end up with a situation where, and I think kind of psychologically
Mm.
on both sides, the moderates as they left, it was very difficult for the second generation, and I would hear this from some of
Mhm.
them,
Mhm.
second generation, sort of
Mhm.
saying, we've got to get past just that we're not we're not whatever fight
Mhm.
somebody had in the SBC.
Mm.
And on the conservative side, what you had was a kind of mentality that sometimes confused quarrelsomeness with conviction, and
Mhm.
said, in
Mhm.
order to really stand up for the gospel, we have
Mhm.
to continue identifying who's the next group of liberals and reenact those those battles
Yeah.
on some other front. That
Yeah.
became very unhealthy.
Yeah. Yeah. You both have kind of gestured toward the fact that there are obviously lots of complex reasons why so many folks have lost interest or lost faith in Christian institutions and are less likely to affiliate with them these days. The thing that you both find yourselves today at the helm of major media organizations, and I'm curious how you think about what you're trying to do and how you think about the audiences that you're trying to reach in this time of historic disaffiliation from Christian institutions. Are you trying to speak to those that remain? Are you trying to sort of speak beyond those that remain? And I'd love to think a little bit with you first, Adam. Here, I mean, when I was first falling in love with history when I was writing a master's thesis on the rise of an evangelical left in response to the Vietnam War, thumbing through pages of the Post-American, which was the magazine that turns into Sojourners at some point. It's really a wild ride if you go back and read issues of that publication. It's very radical, very visceral, biting critique of kind of the American project, of American church's complicity and nationalism and capitalism at a really deep level. And I was reading that, in the early 2000s when Jim Wallace was coming, back onto the national scene and kind of the era of George W. Bush's presidency, kind of as I think, evangelical counterpart, right, to the religious right, saying, "Yeah, you don't have to be, evangelicals don't have to be the religious right. We can, we're not Republicans or Democrats. We can do other things." But at that point, I think by that point, his politics had become more sort of liberal in a generic sense, right? That sort of like he maybe didn't identify as a Democrat, but he was sort of in that larger camp. You know, and I think still pretty strongly identified as evangelical. I was looking up on Sojourners' website in advance of the conversation and trying to figure out, I mean, do you all still think of yourselves as an evangelical organization? How do you think about the politics? I mean, a lot of young people today are drawn actually to more radical politics. How do you think about what you're doing? How do you think about the audiences you're trying to reach?
Yeah, I think that, well, let me make a couple points. One is
Yeah.
that we still see ourselves as an evangelical organization, although I'd say with the small e, not the big E.
Uh-huh.
What
Uh-huh.
I mean by that is, the heart of the evangelicalism, or the evangel, is spreading the good news of Jesus
Mm-hmm.
Christ, and that is still central to our mission.
Mm-hmm.
And we think that good news is inextricably linked to a commitment to protecting and serving the least of these, certainly a Matthew 25 commitment, but also a commitment to addressing many of the structural sources of injustice and of oppression that existed throughout our history and continue to exist today. And so, one of the kind of through lines in that radical history, if you will, is a commitment, very much based on Romans 12, to be not conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds. So this kind of countercultural commitment. How do we as Christians be salt and light and be that countercultural force? Also a commitment to push back against, some of the notions that still exist today, that primarily our faith is kind of a private matter, that the most important thing, or the only thing, is our personal relationship with Jesus. And at worst, faith kind of getting reduced to fire insurance from hell. Now, I think, fortunately, even the evangelical movement has moved quite past that in a lot of ways. But oftentimes there's not this deep sense that our faith and our relationship in Christ, that redemptive relationship, then enlists us in God's kingdom building purposes in the here and now. And that's where this commitment to tzedek, to mishpat, and to hesed come in, a commitment to justice, righteousness, not just a private righteousness, but a communal righteousness, and a commitment to steadfast love. And so, we as an organization have as our tagline, faith in action for justice and peace. And, while some of our issues that we focus on may align more with one part of the political system than another, we have been pretty consistent in critiquing, sometimes at our own expense, the Democratic Party and of course the Republican Party as well. And I think I'll give you a recent example. We, on the 1-year anniversary of the horrific invasion and war in Ukraine, really came out with a strong article and statement saying, this is a moment where we should be talking a lot more about diplomacy. That is not a popular position really in either party right now, or it's not the dominant perspective. And we were really trying to paint a picture or try to provide a roadmap for how we could pursue more aggressive diplomacy that could lead to some kind of settlement and peace. We have been very critical of both Republicans and Democrats around not prioritizing a commitment to economic justice and to addressing, let alone ending poverty in this nation. And that's been a consistent priority for Sojourners. Furious by the fact that we saw a huge policy victory in the child tax credit, which under the American Rescue Plan was made permanent and fully refundable. That single policy, which we championed alongside many others, helped to lift 40% of children in this nation out of poverty. And because of a lot of our broken politics and because of a lot of Republican resistance, we ultimately saw that commitment disappear. And we're now back to where we were before, at least in terms of that tax credit. So anyway, I could point to a number of examples like that, but I think that that radical edge is still there. The last thing I'll just emphasize is that we have always emphasized the inextricable link between, or connection between, spiritual renewal and justice. That the reason we're committed to justice is because of our faith, not in spite of our faith, and that we need our faith to be able to animate our work in pursuing justice. And that shouldn't just copy or imitate what happens in the secular world, that there are particular spiritual gifts, I call them smooth stones, borrowing from the story of David and Goliath, that we can bring into building movements and social change that I think are really desperately needed right now. And one commitment is just a very simple but very hard one, following in the commands of Jesus, is to love our enemies. There is so much dehumanization and demonization that's taking place in our politics right now. And we've got to figure out, how do we engage in politics in a prophetic way without then, demonizing those who disagree with us.
I want to come back to that in a little bit. I want to come over to you, Russell. I mean, I think it's been a really interesting few years at CT, obviously, kind of been a flagship publication of evangelicalism for a couple generations now, coming out of the kind of Billy Graham era in the 1950s. 2019 called for Trump to be removed from office, and the next year, that made a huge splash. Obviously, I mean, white evangelicals had supported Donald Trump so overwhelmingly in 2016. So lots of coverage of that. But the next year, white evangelicals came out again in really robust support of Donald Trump, which, I mean, I think raises this question as I think about CT and its mission and its audience. Does it still think of itself as speaking for evangelicals? Who do you all, what is that sort of disjuncture between CT's sort of call for the, former President Trump to be removed, and then, sort of the enduring loyalty of white evangelicals? What do you make of that?
Well, the editorial was before my time, so I can't really speak to all of the processes and thoughts that went into that. But what I can say, CT never saw itself as being a mouthpiece and mobilizer for evangelical Christianity, but as a place that tells the stories and works with the ideas within evangelical thought. So there is a sense in which CT never is speaking to the immediate moment, but taking the moment as it is and saying, how did this happen and where can we go from here? And I think that's what is of most value right now, and especially when there is a heritage. I mean, Adam talked about the smooth stones and the gifts that he saw in his wing of the church. I definitely see that within evangelical Christianity, including the personal emphasis. Not to say that that all of Christianity is privatized. That was the very thing that CT was founded to oppose, both a kind of social gospel left and the sort of right that would say personal salvation is what matters, public justice does not. CT has said, no, we're a biblical people, and that means that we believe all of it. And that also means that there's an emphasis on the need for new birth that actually is eclipsed in almost every part of not just American religion, but in many parts of world religion as well. In which whether nationalist movements or strongmen and dictators or cultural trends all wish to use religion in order to make their cause transcendent. We're here to say, let's discuss what God's doing around the world. Let's think through these ideas that can take us to a better place. And in the midst of that, let's remember, you must be born again. Christianity is not about power, no matter whose power is competing with one another. It's about the Spirit.
Yeah. Can I make one other point?
Yeah, please. Yeah, please.
Kind of tied into that. So one just emphasis. So Sojourners really has always been an ecumenical movement. We're a healthy mix of mainline Protestants, of evangelicals or people that self-identify as evangelical, of Black church, of predominantly Latino churches, peace churches, and more. Yeah. But one of the things that I think we have to be really honest about is increasingly the kind of evangelical movement has become associated with, or you could argue hijacked by, a very, I would argue, overly political identity. So if you even look at the kind of growth among white evangelicals, polling is showing that many of those folks say they're evangelical because they identify evangelicalism with former President Trump. And many of them, or disproportionate number of them, are not attending a church regularly, don't necessarily subscribe to the kind of core tenets of evangelicalism as we understand them to be. And then historically, I come out of the Black church tradition. And in my tradition, we are very evangelical in many ways, but because the movement has been often so associated with this kind of very conservative white movement, it makes it very difficult for the evangelical movement to be this umbrella that includes a lot of people that actually share core theological convictions and beliefs. And so I think this is kind of a moment it's kind of an inflection moment for not just the evangelical movement, but the church more broadly, to really be clear about where can we find unity and what are some of the core principles that we think are most important. And I would really start with a understanding commitment to Imago Dei, that we're made in the image and likeness of God, and a real commitment to Matthew 25, at least two starting places. Obviously, it doesn't cover everything, but I think provide a lot of common ground.
Yeah, I think the two of you might agree about that piece about certain corners of maybe the evangelical world or broader Christian world having been overly politicized or emphasizing politics, making politics more central maybe even than faith. I do wonder, Russell, if you think. There's this big project that comes online in the 1940s and 50s, right? And kind of around Billy Graham and Carl Henry and that sort of trying to push away from fundamentalism, re-engage the world in a kind of, this is a controversial word, winsome way and try to, talk to like a sort of wider crowd and sort of a world influencing, ambitious movement. I mean, I do wonder if in the last 5 or 10 years at CT, and I know you're relatively new there, but as you look ahead, is that, I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of CT, right? In evangelical worlds, there's been a lot of, or folks who call themselves evangelical, who see CT as too far left or too far. I don't know what the different sort of, is there still a kind of critical mass of folks who are in that, what you might think of as the Billy Graham, Carl Henry mold, looking to do that project in that way, or is that less there maybe than it was a generation ago? What do you think about that?
No, it is still there. The Billy Graham project, if we want to use that language, didn't exist with Billy Graham at first, at least in the sense that people were able to identify this massive coherent movement that Billy Graham then represented. He was speaking to a group of people who felt alienated because they believed in the complete authority of Scripture. They believed in hell. They believed in evangelism. They believed in all of the orthodox doctrines of the faith, and they didn't wish to define themselves over an ever narrowing and ever angrier brand of Christianity. And what happens is he and others sparked the imaginations of people to say there is a way to do this. And we're in a moment right now where every institution in American life is fragmented and disoriented, and all the old coalitions and alliances are being mixed up. But new coalitions and alliances are coming together at the same time. That can be disorienting as well. But it also brings a great opportunity. And one of the things I'm seeing is that when you say, well, a lot of criticism of CT, a lot of criticism of everything. I mean, there is no institution in American life unless someone says we're not going to speak at all. And our viewpoint is that if we point to the glory of Christ and we tell the truth, which means we're not a PR agency for everything's fine in the church. We tell the truth, but we tell the truth without cynicism, but with a genuine hopefulness. I mean, part of what it means to be an evangelical Christian is to be part of a renewal and revival movement that believes that renewals and revivals happen. And believe that they happen not by calculated strategies, but by people who are at a point of often disillusionment and a sense of what's next.
Yeah. We've been talking a lot about churches and Christian organizations. Let's just zoom out for a second. This is a series on the future of American democracy. There's obviously been a lot of talk in recent years about kind of the viability of this American project, and does American democracy have a future is a question that certainly has been much in the conversation in recent years. And I wonder, as you all look out kind of beyond your organizations, at kind of the wider society in which we all find ourselves, and maybe I'll come to you on this one first. I mean, how do you think about this moment? I mean, is American democracy at risk? Is that overblown? Is it? I mean, how do you think? And if it is at risk, what's put it at risk? What are the greatest threats that we face?
Yeah, I would argue that American democracy is in a fairly fragile place, and we are in a perilous moment. I mean, I think we are kind of in an inflection moment, similar to Dr. Martin Luther King's last book that he wrote in 1967 before he was assassinated in 1968 was called "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" And kind of my remix of that question, which I think is an extremely prescient one and timely one for us today, is where do we go from here? Fascism or a truly just multiracial democracy? And it might sound like hyperbole that I'm using the word fascism, but I do think that we are seeing the rise of fairly alarming authoritarian forces or anti-democratic forces in our country. And sadly, a lot of those forces are being kind of sanctified and supercharged by Christianity, in particular, some parts of the evangelical movement. It pains me that the constituency, if you will, that was most believing and most promulgating of the big lie that the last election was stolen because of widespread voter fraud were white evangelicals. And, there are exceptions to that. I'm grateful for Russell Moore and many people at CT that did provide a really bold witness in the kind of lead up to that election. But, I think that we have seen throughout our history ways in which religion and Christianity in particular have been weaponized to limit the people, to essentially limit the rights, the liberty and justice for all to just a small minority, starting with landholding white men when our country was founded. And yet we've seen another counterforce of Christianity being kind of tapped into and mobilized to expand the we, to ensure that liberty and justice for all truly does extend to all. And certainly through the women's suffrage movement, saw the gain of the access to vote to women, and later civil rights movement through the crowning achievement of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But we're now in kind of this really critical phase where it is really essential that Christians of all stripes defend the right to vote as being sacred, that it is one way in which we honor and protect the Imago Dei that is in every person, and that this kind of pretense that's being used around voter fraud is really kind of named as a lie. Russell Moore just talked about the importance of the truth. We know, based on lots of evidence and lots of court cases, that there was not widespread voter fraud in the last election, that it's more likely to commit voter fraud than it is to be hit by lightning in this country. And that has been used as a pretense to try to support the passage of new restrictions and barriers that make it more difficult for Black and brown voters in particular from exercising their sacred right. What's even more alarming to me, and this is why I do think it's a more moment of peril, we have seen 20 states that have passed bills that make it possible or easier for state legislators to overturn election results and to politicize election officials. Now, we didn't see the kind of fruits of that in this last election because it wasn't a presidential one. But in 2024, we're going to see serious tests to our electoral system. And I want to see every part of the church and Christians across the board really standing up for the right to vote and standing up for democracy, because it is something that we have to fight to protect. And again, we've got a lot of forces that I think are still quite powerful, particularly within the Republican Party, that are really posing an existential threat to the health of our democracy.
Russell, what do you think? Is American democracy imperiled, or is that overblown?
Yes, American democracy is imperiled over a long term because of what we're facing. The end result of that probably doesn't look like what we've seen before. And so for some people, the idea, we're not going to have another civil war. I don't think we will, at least the way that the way that we did before. But we can end up with a country that no longer has a commitment to shared democratic principles, and a country that does not exist in the same factual universes. And that's part of the problem right now, is that when one is saying, look, the democracy we've been given is really fragile and has to be conserved from one generation to the other. A great many people don't take that seriously because they assume things will always go back to normal. And so a great deal of what happens can happen in this theatrical manner, sometimes by people who know that they're not telling the truth. The sorts of things that people say behind closed doors, as opposed to what they then say on television or on social media or somewhere else. That's part of the problem. And appealing to a constituency by saying, in order to prove my identity within the tribe, I have to continue saying more and more extreme things in order to appeal to that. Well, that ends in tears, and I think in many cases we've already seen that, but it could be much worse. And I think that one of the problems is that there's this sense that something is just going to fix this, and so there will be some kind of I would hear from pastors a lot who would say, it's a crazy time, but maybe there's a Pearl Harbor or a September 11th. There's some national emergency that resets our priorities, and we all come together. Well, we had a national emergency. We had a global emergency, and we saw that did not rally people together into victory
Mm-hmm.
gardens the way
Mm-hmm.
World War II did, or to yellow ribbons the way that the immediate days after September 11th did. It furthered the fragmentation. And so in order to address this, the first thing we have to do is to take it seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just say one thing related there?
Yeah,
that,
please. Yeah.
So in my book, More Perfect Union, I talk about the dangerous rise of what I call toxic polarization. So we know that our country's been divided in lots of ways, since the beginning. But that those divisions have become more toxic, in part because of, I think, the power of social media, and in part because increasingly we have a politics of division that is incentivizing many of the forces that just make those divisions worse. So, I'll give you an example. In the most recent election, the midterm election, 90% of all congressional seats were decided in the primary, not in the general election. And 8% of the electorate that was eligible to vote voted in the primary. Now you can imagine who those 8% were disproportionately. They were more the strident, ideological, partisan voters. And so, they are essentially pushing politicians to be more strident, to be more extreme. And that, has become a very powerful force in our politics. Some of that, certainly also reinforced by gerrymandered districts and, a lot of other structural changes that need to be made in our political system. And so I think we need to contrast that with what I describe as a politics of the common good, which is a politics that, again, refuses to demonize the other side, that tries to break out of this zero sum, us versus them thinking, which again, I think is very much a part of the politics of division, and that doesn't see compromise or seeking common ground as, some kind of bad thing. It's not the enemy. It's a part of politics, right? Fortunately, I think we do have many politicians that are trying to recreate our politics in a new light. But again, a lot of these forces are very strong. And I really am hopeful that the Christian witness could be the game changer in this. Even though, yes, that percentage of the population is declining, Christians are still in the majority. And if they really stood up for a kind of multiracial, just, inclusive democracy and shared a moral vision, and I make the case that the beloved community, which is the vision that animated the civil rights movement, could be that unifying vision that is rooted in our most sacred civic values and religious values, and that embraces the fact that we are increasingly a religious pluralist nation, and that shouldn't be a threat to Christians. It's actually something I think we can embrace. That I think is the way out and the way forward.
Let me follow up there. I mean, and I think, polarization, it was a huge theme of this series in the fall, and a huge challenge for the country as a whole as we think about moving forward, finding a way forward in this moment of peril. It's also a huge challenge, not coincidentally, within Christian circles. And Adam, you sort of just referenced this, and I wonder, I mean, you're both Baptists, but I think you probably disagree. I think, based on your public statements, a little bit what you've said here today on some theological questions, on maybe on political questions. I wonder if you think about yourselves, the two of you in particular, and just, as part of thinking about this more broadly in Christian worlds in the US today, do you see common identity with other Christians who think differently theologically or vote differently than you do? Is it important to try to build bridges within and among Christians who, again, may have very different theological outlooks or different political outlooks? As far as I can tell, it's quite an unpopular project these days. You certainly won't get touted on Twitter for seeking to build bridges to the other side. Here at Princeton Seminary, it's a pretty theologically heterogeneous place, and there's a lot of pressure, I think, to not be that way. And our student body in particular really comes from all over the kind of Christian map, and I think some of them feel that they wish we were, more of a, one, kind of had a side that we were clearly on. So I don't know. I mean, is it important to sustain places where there are those kind of heterogeneous theological, and so A, do you think it's important, and B, do you see it happening in your own organizations or beyond? Russell, you want to give that one start with you there?
Well, I would start with it depends on what we mean by
Mhm.
on the same side,
Yeah.
because I think that's really one of the problems is
Mhm.
that often in American life right now we see this binary of the good people and the bad people, however however you
Mhm.
define it. And I'm with you. If I'm with you,
Mhm.
that means I'm with you 100%, and I prove my loyalty to you.
Mhm.
And if I'm against you, then I'm completely against you, and you're a threat, an existential threat to me. And so
Mhm.
there's this. Then there becomes this sort of mythological understanding that somebody's going to have total exuberant victory,
Mhm.
and somebody's going to have apocalyptic
Mhm.
final defeat. I mean that is
Mhm.
not the way
Mhm.
that this works. And so when it comes to seeing ourselves on the same side, whatever group of
Mhm.
people that is, I
Mhm.
don't think that is by a least common denominator. Let's get rid
Mhm.
of our distinctives and our
Mhm.
differences, which
Mhm.
actually is harmful to the
Mhm.
project itself,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
we can't help one another with blind spots and weaknesses and burdens if we don't
Mhm.
bring the things that are unique to us.
Mhm.
We are, though, on the same side in terms of saying in many cases there might be issue by issue by
Mhm.
issue moments, whether that's in a local community
Mhm.
or whether that's at the national level, of saying we might not agree on
Mhm.
issues A through C.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean that on issue D, I see where you are and
Mhm.
choose the
Mhm.
opposite of that. We can work together on issue D.
Yeah.
And as we work together on that, sometimes we find, well, we actually can learn from one another on why we hold different positions on A,
Mhm.
B, and C,
Mhm.
and we actually have a lot more in common on solving issue E.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think I think that this sense of, I mean, Christopher Freeman, the political scientist, says that one of the problems is a loss of cross-cutting identities,
Mhm.
that there aren't many people in American life who both go to Walmart and to Whole Foods.
Mhm.
And you don't find vegan Unitarian Republicans. I mean, or, liberal Democrats who go to the shooting range. You know, those
Right.
those sorts of things decreasingly exist. But the cross-cutting identities are important in order to say um, there's more than causes and movements and ideologies.
Mhm. Mhm.
People are people, and a
Yeah.
country is a country, and I think that we can do.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, that's good. We talked about this a little earlier, but just to underscore it again, I think one of the things that we have to be careful about and kind of committed to rejecting is this temptation to make our political or partisan or ideological identities primary. And then it's almost like we overlay our faith on top of that. And of course, we know that the scripture can be misused and abused to justify almost anything. Certainly was used to justify slavery and Jim Crow segregation and so much more. And so, I do think there's kind of a really critical importance of trying to anchor those of us who say that we're followers of Christ, our shared Christian identity, and then to recognize that there are I think some core principles that we can actually agree to that are rooted in
Mhm.
scripture. But then applying those to the messiness of politics
Mhm.
is where all kinds of disagreement should be possible and should happen. We should be able to, have real civil debate. And I'd actually like to see the church to be that place where we could have
Mhm.
some of the best civil debate about
Mhm.
how to apply some of our core Christian convictions and principles to the messiness of politics. The kingdom of
Mhm.
God is never on the ballot. There is no
Mhm.
candidate that perfectly represents the
Mhm.
totality of what our
Mhm.
Christian faith should say we should be doing or should be acting and deciding upon. And so,
Mhm.
I think just creating that space where we can seek Christian unity, which is a
Mhm.
core Christian commitment or should
Mhm.
be, while creating more space and grace for differences of perspective and opinion is really, really necessary right now. And I think
Yeah.
where that gets particularly hard is where that can kind of rub up against racism, that can rub up against sexism, that can rub up against homophobia and kind of a lack of inclusion and respecting the dignity of people that identify as LGBTQ. And that's where I do think that we've got to have a more inclusive church. They still can disagree on some of those theological issues, but really errs on the side of love and inclusion over, I think too much of the judgment that has been kind of the leading edge rather than the love and inclusion.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those areas where I imagine the two of you have different theological points of view on sort of that last question, and I wonder, I mean, it seems like one of the challenges with making progress and finding, here's a point C and point E we have a commonality on, is that increasingly Americans don't live near people or go to church with people that they disagree with, right? And the very absence of those cross-cutting identities makes it really difficult to find traction. And on top of that, I think there is a kind of, I interviewed Anand Giridharadas in the fall about his book, The Persuaders, which is really a kind of, he's a person on the left writing a kind of friendly critique of the left and saying, that you have to make space for folks who want to do bridge building work. Because I think both on the right and the left, there can be a lot of rush to kind of criticize people who are building those bridges and trying to do that kind of relational work, which is tough and not for everybody. Do any of you, I mean, I don't know, Russell, do you see, from your perch where you're at today, are there places where you see this kind of coalition building work or bridge building work happening well? Are there places where you'd like to see it happen, maybe that it's not happening right now?
Yes, I do see it happening all over the place. And one way that's happening is that the healthiest churches in my tribe of the world are increasingly connected to the global church in multiple ways, including the first step of recognizing that the kingdom of God is not the United States of America, and then flowing out from there. So I do see that happening. I think one of the keys to this will be Amanda Ripley's book, High Conflict, talks about identifying the conflict entrepreneurs in any situation. So, and I see this often even in local congregations where there's conflict that is fueled over often completely imaginary issues, preventing conflict over sometimes really important issues, but conflict that could ultimately be resolved one way or the other. Instead, it's just a series of fake controversies that are intended just to show where the lines are. That I think is very dangerous, and ultimately, I mean, I long for theological conflicts and arguments because we're in a time where really across the spectrum of American religious life, it seems that what actually seems real to people are their ideological identities. And that's part of the problem. They don't see that there actually is a larger fabric to the universe. I believe a personal God who holds all of those ideologies and movements and factions in judgment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Maybe it's coincidental, maybe it's providential that I've got the earth as my background, but I want to underscore what Russell just said, that, God so loved the entire world that he gave his only begotten son. I do think that connection to global Christianity, the global body of Christ, is really, really critical. And while, yes, Christianity has been declining in Western Europe for decades, and now the United States is kind of catching up to some of those trends, the global church has been exploding, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Latin America and some parts of Asia. So I think both from a perspective of kind of humility, but also of renewal, there's a lot that we can and should learn from the global church. The other thing that we haven't kind of named this directly yet in the conversation. I just want to put it on the table. I think there have been various mutated versions of a kind of Christian nationalist viewpoint theology. I would argue it's a heretical theology that are resurfacing and are resurgent today, that I think we have to be really, really mindful of and really courageous in denouncing, but also trying to disciple people out of some of those false convictions and beliefs. Brookings and PRI came out with a pretty significant poll about 2 weeks ago, where they found that nearly 30% of Americans identify with this statement that this country really was founded by and for European Christians, and that it should stay that way, or that you should kind of use the state to help keep it that way. I'm kind of paraphrasing. And these beliefs that we're a Christian nation. Yes, we were founded on Christian ideals and values, but the founders, as we know through the First Amendment, enshrined a commitment to reject an established religion and embrace the free exercise of religion, which I actually think helped to enable the church and religion to flourish in America compared to many other parts of the world, including in Europe. We also know that this kind of sense that we're a chosen nation can unfortunately kind of lead in a direction, a more dangerous direction of triumphalism and of kind of supporting various forms of supremacy, including white supremacy. And so, these kind of toxic forces are very much at play within our society, but also have bled into the church. And I think we have to be really, really intentional about how do we disciple people away from and out of those toxic beliefs. And to me, one of the greatest threats to our democracy today is white Christian nationalism. And I would argue it's probably the greatest threat to the Christian witness. And so, Sojourners, alongside many others, are really trying to address this. And I know, Russell, you have certainly talked about this and named it in some ways, but just hope that we can find more ways to work together from all across the political spectrum in order to do that well.
I want to sort of run with that for a second, Adam. I mean, I do think, I think I've heard both of you say, both here and in other contexts, that Christianity and certain forms of Christianity have been a huge part of the problems that we face, that our democracy faces, that our churches face. That certainly in the U.S. and even before this country's founded, that the kind of toxic blend of Christianity and white supremacy and that does remain very much with us in our present moment. It is one of the great challenges that we face as Christians and as a society. Russell, you've named this in a variety of different contexts, talking about Jesus would not have stood for this kind of, I think, Adam, you said mutation or whatever of Christian faith. I wonder if, as we think about Christian institutions and the role that they might play, in terms of forming folks and somehow discipling folks away, from this sort of toxic kind of theology. Do you see that happening? I mean, we it's one thing to publish op-eds and to say the right things, but how do we actually form people in a different way? And do you see that happening, Russell, in kind of the churches that you've spent time around?
Yes. And one of the most important way, I think, to do that is to give an imaginative future of what an alternative looks like. And so often what's happening is you have people who have these false conceptions of where they have to go in order to belong. And so I either have to accept Christianity as a vehicle for white identity politics, or I have to secularize. When in reality, these forms of Christian nationalism are not intensifications of Orthodox Christianity any more than polytheism is an intensification of monotheism. These are two very different things. And so presenting a vision of what that looks like is important. And then also realizing that for many people, the problem will not be with the advocates of some of these views, whatever they are, but the people who simply overhear them and don't quite know how to define them or to think them through. That I think becomes very dangerous, and that's especially true when in many, especially in church context, but I see this in American life too. Often the healthier people tend to be the least engaged, precisely because they're not wholly subsumed by their ideology. And the unhealthiest people tend to be the most constantly engaged, which means that they're the ones whose voices are heard. That has to be changed.
Yeah.
One of the things that, just to really quickly, and Russell, I will follow up with you on this, I promise. But one of the projects that Sojourners is working on is tied to a campaign that we have been doing in partnership with the Skinner Leadership Institute called Face United to Save Democracy. And we're really trying to mobilize faith leaders in a completely nonpartisan way to essentially protect the sacred right to vote and ensure that people all across the country vote, and also, are motivated to vote. Somewhat linked to that, we're developing a kind of theological framework that I describe as civic discipleship. So how do we develop a more robust theology that really roots a commitment to being engaged civically, but rejects the two kind of extremes that we've referenced? So one extreme is where you weaponize religion or our faith to basically support one political agenda, one political party. The other says that no, our faith is actually apolitical, and you actually see this in a lot of Baptist circles. Many Baptists sometimes feel like because the political system is just so corrupt and so broken, I don't want to corrupt my faith, so I'm just going to kind of stand on the sidelines and not engage. And I would argue that's actually not a faithful way to follow Christ, particularly in a democratic system, even if our democratic system is flawed. Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said that to be silent is actually a form of speech, and to not to act is a form of action. And so when we don't exercise our voice through voting, we are essentially giving license to the status quo, and we're not fulfilling our commitment, in my opinion, to protect the most vulnerable and the most marginalized in our midst. And so anyway, we're trying to develop a more robust theology. The Catholic Church kind of has it through Catholic social teaching, but mainline churches and evangelical churches and more don't necessarily have the same shared framework. And I don't want this just to be a Sojourners framework. I want this to be a framework that resonates across many different parts of the church, and it might be an opportunity to work together in some way, Russell.
We're running out of time, and we've covered a lot of ground here. I wonder, like I said, I teach at Princeton Seminary, and we mainly train folks who want to be Christian leaders. They want to go out and lead in the church and in the wider society. For all the reasons we've been talking about for the last hour, it's a tough time to do that. And I wonder if, just by way of closing, if you both might have a word of advice or a word of encouragement or something that you think for folks who are training to do Christian leadership in this moment, what would you say to them? I don't know if one of you wants to go first.
I would say, first of all, remember why it is that you have been called into ministry. And so think through at the very beginning, what are the beliefs and practices and communities that matter the most to me? And that means less about writing down the way that you think about whatever issues are in front of you right now. It means less about that than having the right orienting point to shape your conscience going into the future, because the pressures are going to be very great, and it doesn't matter what kind of ministry you're doing. It doesn't matter in what theological tribe and what political tribe. The pressure is going to be let me just yield to whatever the crowd expects of me at the moment. And you can do that very easily by convincing yourself, I'm just going to conserve my influence for later on in a way that conserves it until your retirement party. And so you have to start out by sort of training yourself on points where you say, what are the ways in which there are issues over which I would say we're not going to divide or fight over this. It's not even worth mentioning. What are the issues in which you will have to say, in order to be faithful to Christ and in order to be faithful to my calling, I can't just accommodate to this. I think learn to do that early and protect your own spiritual connection to God. I mean, I know it's probably unexpected that the evangelical guy would say, read your Bible and stay close to Jesus. Because I believe reading your Bible and staying close to Jesus is going to be absolutely necessary to survive.
Hard to beat, read your Bible and stay close to Jesus. But I plus one now. Let me offer two additional pieces of advice. One is, and Russell kind of touched on this, but I think developing a peer network is really critical. And we're trying to do that through Sojourners. You can certainly learn more about some of the ways we're trying to resource and support church leaders at sojo.net. We actually developed a curriculum that's going to be kind of being revamped right now, but it's going to be coming out in the next couple of months. It's called Bridging Divides, and it's really trying to help support pastors figure out how to navigate, some of these really difficult challenges and trends that we talked about really in relation to polarization. And so, offer that up as an opportunity. The other one is something that I have learned from my own pastor, Pastor Howard John Wesley. When he's giving a sermon that might be more controversial or that's addressing what might be sensitive issues, he often prefaces a sermon by saying, my job as your pastor is not to get you to think or to act or to vote the same way I think and act and to vote. My job is to get you to think more critically and more theologically about the matters and the issues that matter most to our life and our life together, and to our faith, of course. And, it's a kind of a simple statement, but it's very disarming. And I think it gets the heart actually of what at least part of the vocation of a pastor is. It's not to, move the whole church to vote one particular way or to think in the exact same way. It's to help them become stronger disciples so that they can help to, figure out for themselves how they are able to live out their faith and apply it to the messiness of politics and their public life. And so, I hope that is helpful and kind of practical advice as you go forward in your careers.
Well, thank you to you both. I mean, I think this conversation has been really helpful and really honestly grappling with some of the great challenges and some of the great problems, and also I think offering some sense of ways forward and what we might be able to do to kind of contribute to a more faithful church and to what God hopes for our society. So thank you both for joining me this morning. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.